oil oversupply is coming out of Western Canada. Canadian oil companies are producing 202,000 more barrels of crude per day than there is pipeline capacity to transport.
Alberta and British Columbia are Canadian provinces known for their wide open spaces, tall mountains, and thick forests. For many years, these regions offered a quiet escape from the noise and bustle of big cities. Travelers would drive past fields and hills to find fresh air and clear views. That changed when work began on a pipeline expansion worth more than 30 billion Canadian dollars. The project involved digging through mountain rock, drilling beneath rivers and roads, and moving millions of cubic feet of earth. Machines as big as houses cut tunnels through solid rock. Heavy equipment rumbled day and night, stirring up dust and bright lights. Noise carried for miles, and local residents felt the steady vibration under their feet. Indigenous communities raised concerns about sacred sites and wildlife. Biologists warned that the sound of passing tankers could upset orcas in coastal waters. But once the work was done, Canada saw new markets for its oil, greater control of its own resources, and a chance to sell to buyers beyond its southern border. To understand why this change happened, and why so many people's lives were altered, it helps to look back at how Alberta's oil riches came to be put to work for the whole country. In the middle of the 20th century, prospectors drilling in Alberta struck black liquid deep underground. Before that moment, Canada's oil output was small. In 1946, the country produced about 21,000 barrels a day, yet it used more than 200,000 barrels every day. That gap forced Canada to import oil, mostly from the United States. When the Alberta fields began to flow, experts found the volume of reserves to be far higher than anyone had guessed. In 1 year, reported reserves jumped from 72 million barrels to more than 3 billion barrels. Production grew quickly. By the early 1950s, Alberta was suddenly a major oil source, changing the economics of energy on Canada's western coast. In those years, British Columbia faced its own limits. The province's growing towns and industries relied on oil shipped in from the United States. At first, companies moved crude over rail lines or by truck on winding mountain highways. These methods worked but cost more, and they could not meet surging demand. So planners looked for a better way, a pipeline. By carrying oil in steel tubes buried underground, they could send a steady flow from Alberta's fields straight to refineries near Vancouver and to customers farther south in Washington and Oregon. Construction on what became known as the Trans Mountain Pipeline began in 1952. The steel pipe ran nearly 714 miles across plains, through forests, up mountain passes, and down river valleys. Survey teams marked the route by foot, clearing trees and leveling ground. Workers used special drills to bore holes under waterways and highways. Where the land was flat, they dug trenches, laid pipe sections end to end, and welded them together. Crews then covered the pipes with soil, left markers, and restored the surface to look much as it did before. In mountain areas, teams built support structures and drove pipe into narrow cuts. The entire job took about a year, finishing in 1953 at a total cost of 93 million Canadian dollars. On the pipeline's opening day, oil began to flow from Edmonton, one of Canada's main oil centres, to refineries near Vancouver and across the border to the northwest United States. That first pipeline could carry up to 100,000 barrels a day. It met the needs of British Columbia, which no longer had to rely on imports. It also let Alberta sell more oil to American buyers. But by the 1980s, changes in both supply and demand meant the line needed upgrades. New refineries needed not just crude oil, but also refined products like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Transporting refined fuel by rail could be messy and slow, so the company that ran the pipeline decided to refit parts of it to carry multiple types of oil products in separate batches. By 1985, nearly 500 miles of the line could deliver gasoline and diesel as well as crude. By 1993, the entire length from Edmonton to Burnaby, just east of Vancouver, supported this mixed service. That change raised capacity to about 260,000 barrels a day. In 2004, another upgrade boosted capacity to 300,000 barrels a day, or about 1.7 million cubic feet every 24 hours. These improvements brought Canada's energy goals within reach. British Columbia's fuel needs were met from Western pipelines, rather than via ships or rail. And by carrying Alberta's heavy crude oil down to U.S. West Coast markets, Canada tapped higher demand buyers. Yet most of the oil produced in Canada, about 98%, still went to the United States. The market set prices, and heavy crude fetched lower rates than light crude. From 2018 to 2019, the price difference reached nearly $50 a barrel. Analysts calculated that limited pipeline capacity from Alberta to other ports cost Canada about $14 billion between 2015 and 2019. Leaders worried that too much reliance on a single buyer made Canada vulnerable to price swings and trade disputes. To address that risk, in 2013, Kinder Morgan, owner of the existing pipeline, applied to build a second line along the same corridor. The idea was to lay a parallel pipe, doubling daily capacity from 300,000 barrels to 890,000 barrels. It took several years of hearings, permit reviews, and consultations with landowners and Indigenous groups before construction finally began in 2019. The government also stepped in, buying the pipeline to guarantee the project's completion after Kinder Morgan threatened to pull out. Early estimates had put the cost at $6.8 billion. By February 2020, projected costs rose to $12.6 billion. Delays, higher labor rates, and more expensive materials drove estimates up again by February 2022 to $21.4 billion. A year later, those figures climbed to nearly $31 billion. When the new pipeline opened in May 2024, the final tally stood at about $34 billion, a price jump of 500% from the initial estimate. Stretching more than 700 miles, the expansion without a single break combines old pipe sections reactivated after upgrades with entirely new segments across wild terrain. In flat farmland, crews simply dug shallow trenches, laid pipe, and covered it again. But in rugged mountain sections, workers faced slopes up to 30 degrees and altitudes over 4,000 feet. In one such pass south of Hope, British Columbia, an Italian specialist firm handled the toughest stretches. In each spot where highways or railways crossed the route, engineers used horizontal directional drilling to bore miles-long tunnels under the surface, preserving roads, rails, and riverbeds above. In total, the project required 52 of these trenchless crossings. 35 went under rivers, including nearly a mile beneath the Fraser River. 24 went under roads and highways. 3 more went under rail lines. Another 557 smaller crossings handled minor roads and creeks. Each one took weeks or months of careful drilling to protect water quality and support safe transport. One of the most demanding parts took place on Burnaby Mountain, just east of Vancouver. The goal was to drill a tunnel through solid rock to carry 3 steel pipes, each 30 inches wide, connecting inland tanks to a new marine terminal at the port. Workers used a tunnel boring machine shipped from Germany. At 400 feet long and weighing nearly 800 tons, this monster of a machine ate through rock in 2 10-hour shifts each day. A dozen operators and engineers monitored the cutting head and removed spoil known as rock chips, which totaled about 1.4 million cubic feet. Building portal entrances required moving an additional 10.6 million cubic feet of soil and bedrock. The noise of the cutter, the lights flashing at night, and the dust from spoil management all created strains for people living nearby. To limit impacts, the project implemented a noise management plan that used barriers and screens around drilling sites. Engines and pumps ran inside sound-dampening enclosures. Lights shone only where needed, with hoods to keep beams from shining into homes. Water sprays damped dusty surfaces, and soil stabilizers held loose dirt in place on slopes. Trucks covering dirt loads ensured no debris blew onto roads. While these measures did not stop all complaints, they did reduce the worst of dust and noise. When local residents or indigenous bands raised new concerns at community meetings, project staff updated practices to keep equipment quieter or work hours shorter near homes. While the expansion carved its way through forests and farms, port upgrades were happening at the pipeline's outlet. At Burnaby's Westridge terminal, workers built new storage tanks and loading docks for oil tankers to dock safely. Pipelines now lead into the facility's docks, allowing ships to load 300,000 barrels of oil in one voyage. That capacity opened the Pacific Ocean to Canadian crude for the first time at this scale. Before, companies sold most oil south through Washington state or shipped smaller cargoes from eastern ports. With sea access, Canada's oil can reach markets in Asia and beyond. Just weeks after the expanded line began operations on May 20, 2024, a tanker left the port bound for China with more than 500,000 barrels of heavy crude. A year earlier, India became Canada's first Asian customer, buying 2 million barrels via the original pipeline. Export options now include India, Japan, South Korea, and other Pacific Rim nations eager for reliable oil supplies. At the same time, shipments to U.S. West Coast ports and refineries in California and Oregon remain vital. Moving oil by sea avoids overland routes that can get congested or shut down by weather and accidents. Beyond shipping, the expanded pipeline also helped narrow the price gap between Canadian heavy oil and U.S. benchmarks. Before May 2024, Canadian heavy crude traded at more than $13 a barrel below U.S. grades. With better access to global markets, that discount shrank to under $10. For an industry producing millions of barrels a day, even small price gains mean hundreds of millions of dollars more in revenue each year. To take full advantage, producers have stepped up output. By early 2024, Canada was running nearly 5.4 million barrels per day, up from around 4.8 million before the expansion. Forecasts show that by December 2025, output could reach 5.6 or even 5.7 million barrels daily. Despite these gains, disputes over the expansion never fully settled. Indigenous nations whose territories the pipeline crosses challenged federal approvals in court, arguing inadequate consultation and threats to water, fish, and hunting grounds. Some bands signed benefit agreements, receiving jobs, training, and revenue shares. Others maintained their legal challenges, citing ancestral rights and environmental protection. Non-Indigenous protesters also took action. In coastal waters, environmental groups warned that tanker traffic could rise nearly sevenfold, from under 600 sailings to more than 4,000 each year. They feared oil spills, collisions, and chronic pollution harming orca whales that depend on clear sound channels to hunt and navigate. Studies show noise from ship propellers, masks, whale calls, and echolocation clicks, making it harder for them to find salmon runs. Many southern resident orcas already lack enough food, with body fat levels lower than healthy norms. More traffic, critics said, risks pushing some pods past a tipping point. Federal and provincial regulators set strict rules for tanker operations out of Westridge. Vessels must follow designated shipping lanes, stay close to shore to allow quick rescue, and sail only during daylight and calm weather when visibility is good. Towboats escort the largest oil carriers, ready to brake or guide ships if engines fail. Crews must report each movement in real time, allowing marine traffic control to reroute vessels if needed. In addition, strict spill response plans stand by with offshore barges, skimmers, and containment booms to act within hours if any leaks occur. Throughout construction, both companies and government agencies pledged to minimize harm. More than 40 independent studies examined effects on air quality, water, wildlife, and local economies. Officials required daily monitoring of noise, light, and dust at dozens of sites. If readings hit warning thresholds, work paused until levels dropped. For sensitive river crossings, fish biologists surveyed habitat before, during, and after drilling. They relocated eggs, installed fish screens on water intakes, and restored stream banks to limit erosion. Where pipelines crossed caribou habitat, workers delayed clearing until after breeding season. They rerouted some sections to avoid bogs and critical wintering zones. Indigenous guardians patrolled construction zones, recording wildlife sightings and sharing local knowledge of rare plants. These efforts cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but project partners argued that long-term benefits to communities and the economy justified the expense. Local jobs and business opportunities grew as construction crews poured into towns along the route. Hotels filled up with pipe fitters, ironworkers, welders, and drill experts. Caterers and equipment suppliers saw a surge in orders. Some communities expanded roads and water lines to meet higher demand. Training centers in Alberta and British Columbia offered short courses in pipeline safety, environmental monitoring, and heavy machinery operation. While some residents worried about traffic and temporary camps, many welcomed the paychecks that came with steady work. For Indigenous bands with joint venture agreements, pipeline profits funded housing, education, and health programs. Band members found jobs as cultural monitors, environmental technicians, and site security staff. At the same time, opponents kept up their legal and public campaigns. Court cases dragged on as appeals and new permit applications moved through the system. Protest camps sprang up along the route, some turning into year-round gatherings. Police moved in at times to clear trespassers who blocked survey teams or staged rail blockades. Media coverage of arrests and court rulings added tension to community relations. Yet million-dollar fines and injunctions did not stop every action. Activists raised money through crowdfunding and solidarity networks. Occasional spill drills and enforcement actions showed the system working. But critics argued that real accidents would pose far greater danger than simulated tests. As the expanded pipeline began operation in May 2024, Canada entered a new chapter in its energy story. For the first time, the country has major capacity to send heavy crude to Asia, reducing its reliance on a single buyer. Refiners in China, India, and other nations can book shipments that once would never reach their ports. At home, British Columbia enjoys more stable fuel prices and lower risks of supply interruptions. Alberta's oil industry benefits from improved market access and smaller discounts on its product. Nationally, taxes and royalties from increased oil sales boost government revenues, which can support public services. Yet the pipeline's legacy remains mixed. For some, the scars of clearing and drilling fade as forests grow back. For others, sacred sites and wildlife corridors will never return to their former state. The noise and dust of construction fade, but the drones of tankers will continue. Legal challenges may still delay new expansions, and market shifts toward renewable energy could reduce demand over time. Climate goals set by provincial and federal governments aim to cut greenhouse gas emissions, pushing companies to invest in cleaner fuels and carbon capture. Whether this pipeline serves as a bridge to a low-carbon future or a long-term reliance on oil remains to be seen. What is clear is that the dream of a quiet getaway in Alberta and British Columbia gave way to one of the largest energy projects in Canadian history. Digging through mountains, drilling beneath rivers, and moving millions of cubic feet of earth changed both the land and the lives of people who call these regions home. The pipeline's route tells a story of engineering challenges, cost overruns, legal battles, and diplomatic deals. It shows how energy needs can unite or divide communities. At its finish, the line carries nearly 3 times more oil than before, opening new markets and changing Canada's place in the global energy map. As global energy demand changes, Canada may face new choices. If more countries shift to cleaner fuels, oil export volumes could fall. In that case, pipeline operators might look at carrying other products, such as low-carbon fuels or captured carbon dioxide. Some plans already explore using old oil lines to move hydrogen or captured emissions. Converting parts of the system could give the infrastructure a new purpose when crude demand drops. The relationship with Indigenous nations will continue to shape how the pipeline runs. Many bands now have formal agreements covering jobs, revenue sharing, and environmental oversight. These partnerships may grow into joint ventures in renewable energy or habitat restoration projects. If new routes or terminals ever come up, early and open talks with all rights holders would help avoid years of court delays. Local governments and regulators will also play a key role. They set noise, light, and spill response rules that keep operations within safe limits. As technology improves, rules may tighten further. For example, regulators might require more real-time monitoring of tanker traffic or stricter standards for welding and coating. Operators must adapt their practices to meet evolving expectations. So, what are your thoughts on this? Tell us in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more content.